On December 18, 1994, 3 friends pushed their bodies through a gap in solid rock, barely wide enough to breathe through. When they stood up on the other side, they became the first living people to see something no human eye had witnessed in more than 20,000 years. What they found inside would force scientists to rethink almost everything they believed about the minds and abilities of our ancestors. It started with nothing more than a breath of moving air. Jean-Marie Chauvet, an experienced speleologist, was walking along the base of a limestone cliff in the Ardèche Gorge of southeastern France with his 2 friends, Elliot Brunel and Christian Hilaire. They weren't on an official expedition. They were simply doing what they often did on weekends, exploring a landscape filled with sinkholes, fissures, and half-explored tunnels. That afternoon, Chauvet noticed a faint current of cool air coming from a small opening in the rock. It was a sensation any experienced caver learns to take seriously, because moving air usually means there's an open space on the other side. The 3 began clearing rubble by hand, widening the gap with hammers and other tools and chipping away at stone that had not shifted for thousands of years. Eventually, the opening became just large enough for a person to squeeze through. Brunel, the smallest of the group, went first. She dropped into darkness and found herself standing in a chamber far larger than anything the surface had suggested. Her flashlight swept across, walls covered in strange, ancient mineral formations. Then the beam landed on something that made her stop. 2 faint red lines clearly drawn by a human hand. She called back to the others that people had been there before them. At first, they assumed the marks might have been relatively recent, perhaps only a few centuries old. But as they moved deeper into the cave, and their lights revealed more of the walls, that assumption completely collapsed. There were mammoths. There were lions with red dots sprayed near their muzzles. There were drawings of rhinoceroses, bears, horses, and other animals. In one chamber, they found a fire pit whose ashes had crystallized into the floor untouched since the last person had walked away. Nothing they were looking at resembled anything modern. It looked old in a way that felt almost impossible. Within days, French heritage officials were notified. By December 29th, Jean Clotz, one of France's leading experts on Paleolithic art, arrived to examine the site in person. He didn't need long to recognize what he was looking at. The cave was authentic, and it was unlike anything that had been discovered before. The French Ministry of Culture officially announced the discovery the following month, and the cave was eventually given the name Chauvet after Jean-Marie Chauvet, even though Brunel and Hilaire had been standing beside him when they discovered the opening. The location itself turned out to matter almost as much as what was inside. The cave sits above what was once a curve of the Ardèche River, in a spectacular stretch of gorges near the natural stone arch known as the Pont d'Arc. Today, the area is protected as part of the Mons d'Ardèche Regional Natural Park. In June 2014, UNESCO added the Chauvet Pont d'Arc cave to its list of World Heritage Sites, describing it as one of the most exceptional collections of prehistoric art anywhere on Earth. But the paintings were only half the mystery. The other half was a question that would take scientists years and multiple dating techniques to answer properly. How had a cave this large, filled with so much fragile material, survived almost completely untouched for tens of thousands of years? The answer turned out to be geological and violent. At some point in the past, a section of the cliff above the cave's original entrance gave way. Massive slabs of limestone sheared off and crashed downward, burying the passage that led inside. For a long time, researchers debated exactly when this happened. Early estimates based on uranium-thorium dating of mineral deposits that had formed on top of the rockfall could establish only a rough minimum age. The method was complicated by the fact that mineral growth can essentially stall during extremely cold glacial periods, making that particular clock unreliable for parts of this period. To obtain a more precise answer, scientists eventually turned to a completely different method, measuring the buildup of a rare isotope called chlorine-30 inside exposed rock surfaces created by the rockfall. Because chlorine-36 accumulates after a rock surface becomes exposed to cosmic rays, researchers could use it to estimate how long ago the rocks had broken free and landed. Combined with more than 80 radiocarbon dates from charcoal, burned bone, and torch marks scraped along the cave walls, a much clearer picture began to form. Humans used Chauvet during 2 distinct periods. The first lasted roughly from 37,000 to 30,500 years ago. Then came a gap of several thousand years with no evidence of human activity. A second group returned and used the cave roughly between 31,000 and 28,000 years ago. After that, the trail of human activity simply stops. No charcoal, no drawings, no fresh torch marks appear anywhere in the cave after that period, despite extensive sampling of the cave floor. A lone ibex bone dated to around 27,000 years ago turned out to predate the final rockfall events, which more recent chlorine-36 analysis places somewhere between roughly 20,500 and 21,500 years ago. In other words, The entrance remained passable in some form for several thousand years after the last artists had walked out, before the cliff finally collapsed and sealed the cave for good. From that moment until December 1994, virtually nothing larger than a beetle or a bat entered the cave. What that seal created was almost a perfect time capsule. No rainfall reached the interior, no wind eroded the pigments, no animals tracked mud across the floor or dislodged debris from the ceiling. The temperature and humidity remained remarkably stable for more than 20,000 years, insulated from the seasonal changes happening on the surface only a few dozen meters away. And that kind of environmental stability is exceptionally rare, and it is the main reason so much survived in extraordinary condition. Before the wider world even had a name for what had been found, however, the cave briefly became a source of controversy rather than celebration. When the discovery was announced publicly in January 1995, some skeptics questioned whether paintings this refined could really be as old as the dating suggested. They argued that the artwork looked too advanced, too controlled, and too sophisticated for such an early period. That skepticism did not survive contact with the evidence, as independent laboratories analyzed additional radiocarbon samples and repeatedly obtained matching results, and as geologists confirmed that the entrance had genuinely remained sealed for tens of thousands of years, the doubts gradually disappeared. What replaced them was a much harder question. How should scientists understand a human population capable of producing art this sophisticated so early in prehistory? Once researchers began systematically mapping the interior, the scale of the discovery became clear. Chauvet consists of a network of connected chambers extending roughly 400 meters into the rock. Inside, archaeologists eventually cataloged more than 1,000 individual images, including more than 400 confirmed animal representations, covering at least 14 different species. There are also hand stencils, handprints, abstract markings, and engravings carved directly into softer sections of stone. What set these animal depictions apart from almost every other known site of comparable age wasn't simply the quantity, it was the subject matter. Most Ice Age cave art known at the time, including sites such as Lascaux and Altamira, was dominated by large herbivores. Horses, bison, deer, and aurochs appear frequently. Chauvet certainly contains plenty of those animals. One famous panel, for example, shows roughly 20 horse heads clustered together in a continuous naturalistic composition. But scattered throughout the cave are also predators that rarely appear in Paleolithic art elsewhere. Cave lions stalk across one wall in what appears to be a coordinated hunting scene. Cave bears and hyenas appear in multiple chambers. A panther or leopard is faintly outlined in one area. In one particularly striking panel, two woolly rhinoceroses face each other with their horns locked, rendered with enough anatomical understanding that researchers have compared the pose with documented rhinoceros combat behavior. These weren't animals Ice Age humans typically hunted for food. They were animals that could kill them. Their presence on the walls in such careful detail suggests that these paintings were not simply hunting tallies or straightforward hunting magic. They may have carried a very different kind of meaning. That distinction matters. For a long time, one influential assumption in archaeology was that Ice Age cave art functioned primarily as practical ritual, images of prey created in the hope of bringing luck or success before a hunt. Chauvet complicates that interpretation. If a significant portion of the imagery depicts animals nobody was hunting, animals that instead represented danger, competition for shelter, or raw physical power, then the purpose of the paintings may have extended well beyond simple survival magic. Some researchers have suggested that predators could have represented status, fear, respect, or even a symbolic dialogue with the most dangerous forces in the artist's world. But, like much of what Chauvet reveals, that remains an interpretation rather than a settled fact. The floor of the cave preserved another story, separate from the paintings on the walls. Soft clay still holds shallow depressions where cave bears once bedded down for the night, along with hundreds of individual paw prints crossing and recrossing the same paths their owners had worn into the sediment over generations. Fossilized bones were scattered throughout the cave, including bear skulls and the horn cores of ibex. In one particularly haunting section, a single set of small human footprints, likely belonging to a child around 8 years old, remains pressed into the clay alongside a parallel line of canid tracks. Those tracks may have belonged to a wolf or possibly an early domesticated dog, although the interpretation remains debated. Whatever the animal was, both trails were left more than 25,000 years ago, and neither has been disturbed since. Cave bears themselves left an enormous mark on the site. More than 150 bear skulls have been recovered from the cave floor, along with thousands of other skeletal remains, making Chauvet one of the richest cave bear sites ever documented in Europe. At least one skull appears to have been deliberately placed on top of a flat limestone block near the center of a chamber. Some researchers argue that its position looks intentional rather than accidental, although that interpretation remains debated. What isn't debated is the timeline. Cave bears used this space as a hibernation den for far longer than humans ever used it for art. They scratched claw marks into the walls and wore smooth trenches into the clay floor through generations of repeated bedding behavior, long before and between the brief periods when people entered with torches. For decades before Chauvet's discovery, the leading theory about the development of prehistoric art followed a relatively simple idea. Art started crude and gradually improved over tens of thousands of years as techniques were refined and passed down. That framework was heavily influenced by French archaeologist André Leroi-Gourhan, whose influential work on prehistoric art helped shape archaeological thinking during the 20th century. For years, the model of gradual artistic progress remained influential. Chauvet didn't fit it. The problem became obvious once researchers examined the painting techniques closely. The artists hadn't simply scratched rough outlines onto bare rock. In several panels, they deliberately scraped away the outer surface of the stone first, exposing a lighter layer underneath. This made their black charcoal lines stand out with far greater contrast. They also used the cave's natural bumps, ridges, and curves to suggest muscle and volume in the animals they depicted, allowing the three-dimensional shape of the rock to become part of the artwork. Some panels show animals with multiple overlapping legs or slightly shifted head positions. When viewed under the flickering, moving light of a torch or fat-burning lamp rather than a fixed electric beam, these overlapping forms could create a genuine illusion of movement. It's a technique that modern animators would recognize instantly. This wasn't the tentative first attempt of a species just discovering how to draw. It was the confident work of artists who appear to have already possessed generations of artistic knowledge. The age of the paintings was the crucial piece of evidence that eventually forced the scientific community to accept just how far back this skill went. Researchers collected charcoal samples directly from the black drawings, along with torch marks and burned bone fragments from the cave floor, and subjected them to radiocarbon dating. By the early 2010s, more than 80 separate radiocarbon results have been compiled from the site. Major studies, including research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, together with additional statistical analysis and independent dating methods, confirmed that human activity in the cave stretched back to the Ornation period, the earliest known culture associated with anatomically modern humans in Europe. Some of the oldest black drawings in the cave have been dated to approximately 36,000 years ago, making them among the earliest confirmed figurative artworks discovered anywhere on Earth. That placed Chauvet's oldest artwork more than 15,000 years earlier than Lascaux, the famous cave in southwestern France that had previously been treated as one of the defining examples of Ice Age art. Lascaux's paintings, discovered in 1940 by teenagers who followed their dog into a hole in the ground, date to roughly 17,000 years ago. Chauvet's oldest imagery predates them by almost 20,000 years. The timeline archaeologists had relied on for decades needed a fundamental rewrite, and it raised a much bigger question than the age of one cave. If humans living through the depths of the last ice age, hunting dangerous megafauna and surviving winters far harsher than anything most of us will ever experience, were already capable of shading, layering perspective, and creating the illusion of movement on rock walls 36,000 years ago, then the old image of primitive humans slowly fumbling their way toward basic artistic competence simply doesn't hold up. These were fully modern human minds operating with a level of symbolic sophistication that researchers are still trying to understand. Notably, there is very little evidence that anyone actually lived inside Chauvet for extended periods. Archaeologists have not found the thick layers of debris typically associated with long-term habitation sites. There are no large accumulated trash deposits and no permanent domestic structures surrounding the hearths. Instead, the evidence points towards something more deliberate and occasional. Many researchers believe Chauvet functioned as a place for specific, purposeful visits, possibly connected to ritual, ceremony, or a belief system that we can only partially reconstruct. One detail makes that idea feel unusually personal. Scattered throughout different chambers are dozens of handprints and hand stencils. Some were created by pressing a pigment-covered palm directly against the stone. Others were made by placing a hand flat against the wall and blowing pigment around it, leaving behind a negative silhouette. Researchers studying these prints noticed something remarkable. One individual, identifiable by a distinctively curved little finger, appears to have left prints in multiple locations throughout the cave system. That means it may be possible to trace the movements of one specific person through total darkness, more than 30,000 years after they walked those chambers, using nothing more than the unique shape of their hand. Even with a discovery that intimate, many foundational questions about who these people actually were remain unanswered. Deep inside the cave hangs one of its strangest images, a composite figure combining the lower body of a woman with the head and front legs of a bison. It is painted on a triangular section of rock that hangs from the ceiling like a natural pendant. Archaeologists still debate what the image was intended to represent. It could reflect an early mythological or spiritual belief, a specific story passed down through a community, or something else entirely that has been lost to time. There is also the unresolved question of the two separate groups who used the cave thousands of years apart. Did the second group know anything about the people who had painted there before them? Did they discover the cave independently? Or did some form of cultural tradition survive across the enormous gap between the two periods? No one knows for certain. Thousands of years is an enormous amount of time. Any direct memory or oral tradition connecting the two groups would seem unlikely on its face. Yet the second group of artists used techniques that, in several panels, closely echo those of the earlier artists. That could point to an unusually durable regional artistic tradition, a shared cultural inheritance passed down through intermediate generations whose own artwork has simply not survived, or an independent development of similar techniques. Researchers remain cautious about choosing between those possibilities without stronger evidence. Once it became clear that a site this sophisticated could exist this early, scientists naturally began asking whether Chauvet was a total anomaly or simply the first example anyone had happened to discover. Beginning in the late 2000s, research teams surveying the broader Ardèche region began examining other rock shelters and caves throughout the same gorge system. Nearby sites have shown stylistic similarities that hint at a connected artistic tradition operating across more than one location in the region, rather than an isolated event confined to a single cave. That broader survey work is necessarily slow. Each new site requires independent dating, careful mapping, and detailed analysis before meaningful comparisons can be trusted. So far, nothing found nearby has matched Chauvet's scale, preservation, or the sheer sophistication of its imagery, but the research has helped place the cave within a wider regional picture, suggesting that Ice Age communities along the Ardèche may have been more interconnected than previously assumed. Protecting what the rockfall had accidentally preserved became an urgent priority the moment the world learned Chauvet existed. Researchers immediately thought back to what had happened at Lascaux decades earlier. That cave had been opened to public tourism for years after its discovery in 1940. By the early 1960s, scientists realized that the enormous number of visitors, combined with the heat, moisture, and carbon dioxide produced by thousands of people breathing inside a small enclosed space, was actively damaging the cave. A green algae growth known as green sickness began spreading across sections of the painted walls. Later, a white calcite haze, known as white sickness, appeared as well. Artwork that had survived intact for roughly 17,000 years was being damaged within just a few decades of tourism. Lascaux was permanently closed to the public in 1963. Determined not to repeat that mistake, French authorities sealed Chauvet from public access almost immediately after its discovery, and it has remained closed ever since. The cave is monitored by a dedicated conservation team. Sensors continuously track temperature, humidity, and carbon dioxide levels. Researchers have also investigated how the cave's fragile internal ecosystem could respond to increasingly extreme weather patterns on the surface. Even small changes in the outside climate can, over time, work their way into a system this sensitive. Filmmaker Werner Herzog was granted rare, limited access in 2010 to shoot the documentary Cave of Forgotten Dreams. The production used specially restricted lighting and a small crew to minimize its impact on the cave. The resulting footage remains one of the only ways the general public has ever been able to see the actual interior of the cave, rather than a replica. Only a small number of approved researchers are permitted inside each year, working under strict time limits and specialized equipment protocols designed to avoid altering the cave's temperature or humidity even slightly. To give the public a way to experience the site without risking irreversible damage to the original, French authorities commissioned a full-scale replica near the real cave, known as the Caverne du Pont d'Arc. It opened to visitors in 2015 and recreates the chambers and artwork in extraordinary detail, including the textures of the stone itself. The genuine cave remains locked away almost exactly as the final rockfall left it, while millions of visitors can instead walk through its meticulously reconstructed twin. What is known about Chauvet does not rest on guesswork alone. Its story has been built from radiocarbon studies, thermoluminescence and chlorine-36 dating, geological surveys of the collapsed entrance, and decades of interdisciplinary research carried out by teams across multiple French institutions. Where genuine uncertainty remains, such as the exact meaning of the bison woman figure, the relationship between the cave's two major groups of visitors, and exactly how such an advanced symbolic system developed, researchers are careful to acknowledge those gaps, rather than fill them with invented narratives. More than 30 years after its rediscovery, Chauvet occupies an unusual place in archaeology. It is famous enough that most people have at least heard its name, yet it remains so tightly restricted that relatively few people have physically walked through its real chambers. That restriction is exactly why the cave has survived in such remarkable condition, and why researchers are still finding new material worth studying decades after its discovery. Using techniques such as chlorine-36 exposure dating, which were not available as practical tools when the cave was first found, scientists continue to extract new information from the site. What began as three friends following a faint current of air through a crack in a limestone cliff became one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the modern era. Chauvet stands as tangible evidence that human creativity, symbolic thought, and sophisticated artistic technique existed tens of thousands of years earlier than many researchers once assumed. A rockfall that could easily have destroyed everything inside instead sealed a small slice of the Ice Age in place, protecting it in near-perfect condition until a chance discovery in December 1994 opened it back to the light. Scientists are still pulling new details from that darkness, using tools and techniques that didn't exist when the cave was first found. And there is a real possibility that the next discovery from those ancient walls could reshape the story all over again. If this kind of deep dive into real archaeology and ancient history is something you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And leave a comment letting me know which mystery from the past you want covered next.